The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the shed, each drop a tiny, insistent drumbeat against my solitude. It had been my sanctuary for the last 5 years, a place where the only voices I heard were the rustling of the overgrown weeds and the sigh of the wind through the skeletal remains of the old factory. Outside, the world churned on, oblivious to my self-imposed exile. Inside, the scent of stale coffee and ozone from my jury-rigged equipment was my constant companion. A sputtering cough from the ancient generator outside punctuated the rhythm of the rain. I winced. It was a sound I knew intimately, a sound that spoke of failing systems and a life clinging to the edge of obsolescence. My hands, once steady as a surgeon's, now trembled slightly as I adjusted a dial on the oscilloscope, its green line a wavering testament to my fading relevance. Then the crunch of tires on gravel, a sound that had no place in my carefully constructed silence. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the grimy window pane. A sleek black car, incongruous against the backdrop of industrial decay, idled at the edge of my property. It was a predator, sleek and silent, waiting. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the headlights. Tall, broad-shouldered, cloaked in the harsh glare of the rain. They approached the shed with an unnerving purpose. My gut tightened. No one came here, not anymore. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of damp, cold air and the scent of expensive wool. The stranger stepped inside, water beading on their dark coat. My eyes, however, were fixed on the briefcase they held. It was polished leather, the kind that spoke of boardrooms and power, not the kind of thing that ended up at the edge of a forgotten industrial wasteland. "I have a proposition," the stranger continued, their voice unwavering. "One that requires your unique talents." My lips twisted into a humorless smile. "My talents are best suited for keeping the rust at bay these days." The stranger took a step closer. I caught a glimpse of a silver badge pinned to their lapel, a law enforcement insignia. My stomach plummeted. This was not good. "We've had a death," they stated, their tone devoid of emotion. "A peculiar one." Peculiar, that word in my previous life had been a siren song, a challenge. I pushed myself up from my workbench, the worn wood groaning in protest. "And you think I'm the man for it?" I asked, my voice rough from disuse. "We think you're the only man who can understand it," the stranger replied, their gaze finally meeting mine. Even in the dim light, I could see the weariness in their eyes, a mirror of my own, perhaps. "It's staged, meticulously, like something from the old files." The old files, the ones that had driven me out here, the ones that had broken me. Important, the stranger pressed the briefcase now resting on my workbench. They opened it, revealing not papers, but a single glossy photograph. I took it, my fingers brushing against theirs. The image was stark, illuminated by harsh police lights, and around it, arranged with almost surgical precision, were objects. A vintage music box, its lid open, a tiny ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. A single, wilting rose, its petals a deep, bruised crimson, and a small handwritten note tucked beneath the rose. My breath hitched. The music box, the rose, the note. I knew these details, not from this case, but from a case 20 years ago, an unsolved case. In an old warehouse district, the stranger said, "Near the docks." The docks, another echo. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of forgotten memories, the faint scent of brine and decay suddenly filling my nostrils. "It's not just this one," the stranger continued, their voice low. "There have been others, similar staging, similar signatures." My hands tightened around the photograph. My carefully constructed piece was shattering, the meticulous order of my isolation dissolving like mist in the harsh light of this grim proposition. This wasn't just a case. This was a ghost resurrected, and it was calling my name. "Why me?" I finally managed, looking up at the stranger. "After all this time?" "Because," the stranger said, their gaze unwavering, "the killer wants you to know they remember." The rain outside intensified, a frantic drumming that seemed to match the sudden, unwelcome surge of adrenaline in my veins. The shed, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The world I had tried so desperately to escape was knocking, demanding my attention. The flashing blue and red lights painted erratic streaks across the slick, black asphalt, a garish contrast to the relentless downpour. I stood just outside the tape, the chill seeping through my worn jacket, the smell of wet earth and something metallic, something I hadn't smelled in years, thick in the air. The official directive had been brief, almost curt, delivered by a voice I barely recognized from my former life. "User MB, we need you now." No explanation, just a summons, and here I was, standing in the miserable, sodden embrace of a fresh crime scene. A uniformed officer, his face a mask of weary resignation, gestured me through the barrier. He nodded, his eyes flicking over my still damp clothes, a silent question hanging between us. I offered a tight, humorless smile. The years had etched themselves onto my face, I knew, but they hadn't dulled the edge of my observation. The air inside the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, was heavy, a stifling mix of plastic sheeting, disinfectant, and that ever-present metallic tang. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the canvas was amplified, creating a claustrophobic echo chamber. My gaze swept over the scene, my mind already cataloging, assessing. It was a practiced, almost automatic response, a ghost of the scientist I used to be. The body lay on a tarp, stark against the muted colors of the tent. It was a man, or what was left of him. The staging was precise, too precise. The way the limbs were positioned, the almost theatrical arrangement of objects around him, it screamed of deliberate intent, not the messy chaos of a spontaneous act. My stomach gave a small, unpleasant lurch. This wasn't random, this was a message. User MB? A gruff voice, familiar and yet alien, cut through the drumming rain. I turned to see a detective, his trench coat glistening, a frown etched deep between his brows. He was older now, his hair flecked with gray, but the sharp, assessing gaze was the same. "Detective," I acknowledged, my voice rougher than I intended. He stepped closer, his eyes lingering on the body, then on me. "They said you were retired." "Circumstances change," I replied, my gaze returning to the tableau before us. The victim was dressed in a worn, gray suit, the fabric clinging to his skin, dark with rain and something else. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the canvas ceiling, a silent scream frozen on his lips. "This is different," the detective stated, his voice low, almost a murmur. "The method, My gloved fingers hovered over a small, tarnished silver locket clutched in the victim's hand. It was open, revealing a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman. My breath hitched. It was a detail I recognized, a detail from a case I had thought long buried, a case that had ended me. "The victim's name is Arthur Finch," the detective supplied, seeing my focus. "Local historian. Lived alone, no known enemies." "No known enemies," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. This wasn't about Arthur Finch. Arthur Finch was a prop, the locket, the pose. This was a performance, and I was the audience, or worse, the star. I pushed myself back up, my joints stiff. "I need access to the lab, and I need the files, all of them," I said, my voice firm, a spark of the old fire igniting within me. I know. The drive back to the city was a blur of flashing lights and the persistent drumming of the rain. The forensic lab, once my domain, now felt like a haunted house, each piece of equipment a ghost of a past I couldn't outrun. The smell of sterile air and chemicals hit me like a physical blow as I stepped inside. It was a familiar scent, yet it brought with it a wave of unease. The hum of the ventilation system, the soft clinking of glassware, it was all a soundtrack to a life I had tried to leave behind. "User MB?" A younger colleague, their face etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, approached me. "I need everything." They hesitated, then nodded, handing me the file. The weight of it felt immense, the pages filled with the ghosts of unsolved mysteries. I ran a gloved finger over the worn cover, the raised lettering of case numbers and dates, each one a scar. I walked to my old workstation, the familiar layout a cruel mockery of my current situation. The equipment was newer, sleeker, but the essence remained the same. I opened the file, the first page showing a faded photograph of a young woman, her smile tragically innocent. The same woman from the locket. This was no coincidence. The rain outside had stopped, but the storm within me had just begun. The canvas of the crime scene tent in the rain. Body just discovered flapped violently around me, each gust a wet slap against my face. Rainwater, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, dripped from the seams, pooling on the stained ground sheets. It was a symphony of misery, the drumming rain punctuated by the hushed, urgent whispers of the uniformed personnel. I pushed the flap aside, ducking my head to enter the confined space. My eyes swept over the scene, cataloging, assessing. The body lay sprawled on its back, limbs at an unnatural angle. The victim was a man, middle-aged, dressed in what looked like expensive but now ruined clothing. The staging was, as the file had hinted, precise. Almost theatrical. A single white rose lay on his chest, its petals already bruised and wilting. My gaze drifted to the forensics technician already at work, a familiar colleague from my previous life. He looked up, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. Wariness, perhaps. He offered a curt nod. I returned it, my own gaze already scanning the details, the small, almost imperceptible things that screamed at me. The way the body was positioned. The specific type of knot used on the belt, even though it wasn't cinched. The faint, almost imperceptible dusting of a fine, gray powder on the victim's left hand. These weren't random details, they were deliberate, they were a language I understood. "Anything?" the colleague asked, his voice low, almost swallowed by the din of the rain. I didn't answer immediately. My mind was already miles away, sifting through archives of memory, through cases long buried and officially closed. The white rose, the specific posture, the gray powder, it was all too familiar. A cold, tight knot began to form in my stomach. "The powder," I answered finally, my voice a little rough. "What is it?" He shrugged, his movements economical. "Still analyzing, looks like some kind of mineral, not common. Not common, but not unheard of either, not if you knew where to look." My eyes landed on a small, almost invisible smudge of the same gray powder near the victim's right ear. It was too precise to be accidental. It was a signature. "The victim's name?" I asked, my gaze still fixed on the body. "Arthur Finch," the colleague replied. "Real estate developer, clean record, no known enemies according to the initial sweep." Arthur Finch. The name meant nothing to me, but the staging. That meant everything. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement, a message. "This is case file 7B Gamma," I murmured, more to myself than to the colleague. He frowned. "What are I talking about? This is a new one, fresh." "It's not new," I insisted, my voice gaining a hard edge. "It's a replay. Look at the belt knot. It's the same as the one used on the victim in the Sterling Creek case. And the rose. It's identical, even the placement." The colleague's eyes narrowed. The failures, he knew my history. He knew why I'd been exiled. "Sterling Creek," he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "That was, 15 years ago, and it was never solved." "Exactly," I responded, standing up, my joints protesting the movement. The rain was beginning to seep into my boots. "And this is how it's being solved, or rather how it's being reenacted. Someone is going through my old cases one by one." He ran a hand over his tired face. "User MB, with all due respect," I reaching. "This could be a coincidence, a copycat maybe." "A copycat with access to my case files? A copycat who knows the exact details, down to the specific shade of gray powder I requested for trace analysis back then." My voice rose, the tension in the tent palpable. "This isn't a copycat, this is a message, and it's directed at me." I walked over to my old workstation, the one the uniformed officer had pointed out. It was still set up, a relic in this modern, sterile setup. I pulled out the worn file I'd been handed earlier. Case file 7B Gamma, Sterling Creek. I flipped through the pages, my fingers tracing the faded ink, the blurred photographs. The victim, the scene, the details that had haunted my sleep for years. Then I saw it, a photograph of a small, almost invisible smudge of gray powder on the victim's temple, the same powder. They know I'm back. The colleague watched me, his expression unreadable. He knew me well enough to see the conviction in my eyes, the fire that had been dormant for so long now rekindled. "We can't jump to conclusions. This could be a trap." "Of course it's a trap," I added, a grim smile touching my lips. "But I'm already in it, and I'm not leaving until I find the one who said it." I looked back at the body, at the white rose, a silent accusation. The rain outside seemed to intensify, mirroring the storm brewing within me. This was more than just a murder investigation. It was a reckoning. The air inside the crime scene tent was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the damp, earthy smell of rain-soaked canvas. Each breath felt heavy, a physical weight against my lungs. The tarp beneath my boots squelched with every step, a constant, unpleasant reminder of the deluge outside. This was the second one, the second meticulously staged tableau. "Anything, User MB?" The voice of the lead detective, gruff and impatient, cut through the hushed activity. He stood by the entrance, his silhouette dark against the gray light filtering through the tent flap. I knelt, my gaze sweeping over the scene. It was a mirror image, chillingly precise, of the Miller case. 30 years ago, a young man found in a derelict warehouse posed like a macabre puppet. The details were all there, the crude hand-painted sign hanging from the victim's neck, the specific arrangement of discarded tools, even the single, wilting daisy tucked into his buttonhole. It was too perfect, too deliberate. "It's him," I stated, my voice flat. I didn't need to look at the victim's face. The signature was unmistakable. The Miller boy, or at least a recreation of his death. A collective sigh rippled through the forensic team. They knew the Miller case. They knew my involvement, or more accurately, my failure. The one that had driven me from the field into the self-imposed exile I'd only recently been dragged from. "A recreation," the detective repeated, stepping closer. He had a way of looming, of making you feel like a specimen under glass. "What are I talking about?" I pointed to the sign. "Look at the brushstrokes, the specific shade of red and the font. It's identical to the sign found at the Miller scene, not just similar, identical." I traced the outline of a discarded wrench with my gloved finger. This tool, it was found exactly here at the Miller scene. The killer is recreating it, every last detail. My mind raced, sifting through the countless hours spent poring over those old files. The Miller case had been my albatross, the one that got away, the one that gnawed at my conscience until I could no longer function. And now it was back, not just back. The detective followed me out, his brow furrowed. "So I rest saying this isn't a copycat? I think it's the original killer." "I don't know," I admitted, which was a dangerous admission for me. I hated not knowing. I hated the uncertainty. But it's too specific, too personal. This isn't just a random act of violence. Now the Miller boy, 2 decades apart, 2 lives extinguished and then resurrected, for what purpose? A message for whom? The detective pressed. I turned back to him, the rain misting my face. For me. The words hung in the damp air, heavy with unspoken history. The first murder, I dismissed it as a tragic coincidence, a deranged individual picking up threads from forgotten crimes, but this was an escalation. This was a declaration. My hands clenched into fists. The old shame, the self-recrimination that had haunted my years of exile began to stir. I had failed those victims, failed their families, failed myself. And now, whoever was doing this was reminding me of it, forcing me to confront the ghosts I'd tried so hard to bury. "We need to go through the Miller case files again," I replied, my voice firm, regaining a sliver of my old authority. "Every detail, every discrepancy. The killer is showing us their hand, but they're also trying to distract us. We can't fall for it." The detective nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He saw it too. This wasn't just about finding a killer, it was about unraveling a personal vendetta. And I was the intended recipient. The rain continued its relentless patter, a mournful soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. The rain hammered against the taut canvas of the crime scene tent, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to amplify the suffocating tension within. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sterile scent of disinfectant, clung to me like a second skin. I knelt beside the body, the flickering glow of the portable lights casting long, distorted shadows across the scene. This was the third one. The third meticulously staged tableau. "Anything, user MB?" The detective's voice, usually a low rumble, was strained. He stood a respectful distance away, his gaze fixed on the tableau, but I could feel his eyes on me, searching for answers I wasn't sure I had. My focus was on the details, the subtle nuances that others might overlook. The victim, a young man this time, was posed with an unnerving stillness. His eyes, wide and vacant, stared at the rain-streaked ceiling of the tent. Around him, objects were arranged with a deliberate, almost artistic precision. A worn leather-bound book, a single wilting rose, a tarnished silver locket, each item a whisper from a forgotten memory, a ghost from my own past. "It's a narrative," I finally murmured, my voice raspy. I traced the edge of the locket with a gloved finger. This one was familiar. I'd seen it before, years ago, in a different context, a different life. He's telling a story, or rather, they are telling a story, and we're the audience. The detective shifted, his boots crunching on the damp ground. "A story about what?" I looked up at him, to cases I'd worked on before everything. Now this young man, I recognized the locket, a case that had haunted me, a case that had been the beginning of the end of my professional life. Her name was Alara Vance. She'd been distraught, terrified, and I'd promised her I'd find justice. I hadn't. "The locket," I answered, pointing. "It belonged to Alara Vance. He was a witness in the Miller case, a disappearance back in 08. We never found him, never found her either, eventually." My breath hitched. This wasn't just a recreation, this was a taunt, a personal message. The detective frowned, consulting his notepad. "Miller case, Vance, yeah, I've seen the files. What's the connection to this guy?" He gestured to the body. "That's the question, isn't it?" I ran a hand over my face, the rough stubble a stark reminder of how long I'd been out of the game. "He's not Alara Vance, and he's not the Miller boy, but he's connected. The killer is weaving a tapestry of my failures, my regrets." I stood, my knees protesting, to not only replicate my past cases, but to use them as a canvas for new atrocities. To do it with such intimate knowledge of my personal history. It implied a level of access, a proximity that I found deeply disturbing. "The book," I responded, pointing to the worn volume. "What is it?" "Looks like poetry," the detective replied, peering closer. "Titled Echoes of the Unseen. Poetry, of course. The killer had a flair for the dramatic, for the symbolic." I picked up the book, my fingers brushing against the faded gold lettering. He was an aspiring writer. She'd submitted a manuscript to a local literary journal. This was it. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory. Alara Vance, her fear, the Miller case, the journal submission. It was all starting to coalesce, forming a picture that was far more complex and terrifying than I had initially imagined. This wasn't just a killer with a grudge against me. This was someone who knew me, knew my work, knew my vulnerabilities. The killer isn't just recreating the crimes, I added, my voice gaining a hard edge. They're recreating the circumstances, the emotional landscape. They're forcing me to relive the helplessness I felt during those investigations. The detective's expression was grim. So what are I saying, user MB? This is personal. It's always personal, I replied, my gaze sweeping over the tableau one last time. The wilting rose, the locket, the book, each element a deliberate choice, a piece of a puzzle designed to break me. But I wouldn't let it, not this time. I had to find the thread, the connection that tied these victims, these cases, and this killer back to me. And I had to do it before the narrative reached its final, deadly conclusion. This was no longer just about solving murders. It was about confronting the ghosts I'd tried so desperately to outrun. I would see this through. I had to. The vinyl walls of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, flapped like a trapped bird against the relentless downpour. Each gust of wind was a physical blow, mirroring the one that had just landed in my gut. Detective Miller, bless his perpetually grim face, was trying to shield me from the worst of the spray, but it was a losing battle. The air inside was thick with the metallic tang of blood, the cloying sweetness of decay, and the sharp, sterile scent of the forensic kits we'd brought in. Anything, user MB? Miller's voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the drumming rain. He gestured vaguely towards the center of the tent, where the outline of the victim lay stark against the gray tarp. I knelt, my gloved fingers hovering over the body. This one was different. The previous victims had been staged, yes, but with a certain theatrical flair, a twisted artistry. This felt raw, urgent. The victim, a young man I didn't recognize from any of the cold cases, was sprawled awkwardly, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the corrugated plastic roof. No wilting rose, no antique locket this time, just a single stark detail that made my breath hitch. A small, tarnished silver charm, shaped like a crescent moon, was clutched tightly in the victim's right hand. I recognized it instantly. It was identical to the one I'd lost years ago, the one my mentor, Professor Thorne, had given me as a graduation gift. He'd had a whole set, he'd said, for his most promising students. Each charm a symbol of their potential. Mine had vanished the night everything fell apart, the night I walked away from the academy, from everything I'd ever known. What is it? Miller's voice was sharp, his attention now fully on me. I carefully pried the charm from the victim's stiff fingers. It was cold, heavy, and etched with a tiny, almost imperceptible T, Professor Thorne. He'd always signed his personal correspondence with that initial. My mind raced, a frantic scramble through years of buried memories. Thorne. He'd been the one to champion my work, to push me beyond the conventional. He'd also been the one who'd been most vocal in my defense when the accusations started flying. Accusations that had ultimately destroyed my career. He disappeared shortly after, citing health reasons, or so the official story went. This charm, I said, my voice tight, holding it up for Miller to see. It belonged to Professor Thorne. He was my mentor. Miller's brow furrowed. Thorne, the one who retired under a cloud. He didn't retire, I corrected, the words tasting like ash. He vanished, and this charm, it was a gift from him to me. The implications crashed down on me heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just a killer recreating my past failures. This was someone connected to my past, someone who knew about Thorne, someone who knew about me. The rain intensified, a frantic drumming that seemed to punctuate my thoughts. Every detail of this scene, from the victim's position to the minuscule charm, felt deliberate. Not just a taunt, but a message. A message from someone who knew me, knew my history, and was now using Thorne's legacy as a weapon. So this killer knows you, Miller stated, his tone flat, but his eyes held a new, unsettling intensity. And they know Thorne. They know of Thorne, at least, I clarified, turning the charm over and over in my palm. The metal was smooth, worn from years of handling. But this is more than just a connection. Thorne was a collector of sorts. He kept meticulous records of his students, their achievements there. Thorne had been obsessed with unlocking the secrets of human behavior, of the criminal mind. He'd believed that understanding the why was more important than the how. He'd also been involved in certain, unofficial research projects. Projects that the Academy had deemed too controversial, too ethically questionable. Projects that had been shut down abruptly with little explanation. He was working on something, I murmured, more to myself than to Miller. Something big, something that involved predicting criminal behavior, identifying predispositions. Miller shifted his weight, his gaze unwavering. And you think this killer is connected to that research? I think this killer is using Thorne's research, I said, my voice gaining a hard edge. And maybe Thorne himself is involved. The thought was almost too much to bear. The man who had been my intellectual father, my guiding star, now potentially a player in this macabre game. The rain lashed against the tent, blurring the edges of my vision. The charm felt impossibly heavy in my hand. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore, and I was right in the middle of it. The midpoint, the turning point, the moment where the game changed, and the stakes were raised to an unimaginable level. I had to know what Thorn had been working on and who else had access to his secrets. Because if the killer was using his research, they were also exposing his past. And I had a feeling that past was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The biting wind whipped under the canvas of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp chill. It had been hours since we'd found the victim, a middle-aged man with eyes wide in a final, silent scream, posed with an unsettling familiarity. Not just to the cold cases, but to something else, something that gnawed at the edges of my memory. The forensic team worked with practiced efficiency, their movements sharp and economical against the backdrop of the drumming rain. I watched them, my gaze drifting over the meticulous details. The killer's signature was there, in the precise placement of the victim's limbs, in the almost artistic arrangement of the few scattered objects around him. It was textbook Thorn, but twisted, perverted. "Anything, user MB?" The lead detective asked, his voice gruff, laced with the impatience of a man who'd rather be anywhere but standing in a puddle of lukewarm rainwater. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on a small, tarnished silver locket clutched in the victim's hand. It was too small, too delicate for a man of his build. Our perpetrator is very fond of their audience. The detective grunted. "Thorn's old cases, you're sure about that?" "As sure as I can be without Thorn himself standing here to confirm it," I replied, the bitterness creeping back into my tone. My mentor, the man who had taught me everything, now a suspect. The thought was a bitter pill. I knelt beside the body, pulling on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the locket. It felt out of place. Thorn's staging was always symbolic, but this felt personal. I gently pried the locket open with a sterile probe. Inside, two tiny, faded photographs, a woman, her features blurred by time and moisture, and a man. My breath hitched. It was Thorn, younger, yes, but unmistakably him. "What is it?" The detective loomed over me. I closed the locket, my fingers trembling slightly. "Nothing, just a personal effect." I couldn't tell him, not yet, not until I understood. Later, back at the temporary lab set up in a repurposed shipping container near the docks, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and damp canvas, I went over the preliminary findings. The victim was a small-time accountant, no known enemies, no obvious connections to Thorn or his past research. Yet the staging, it was a carbon copy of the Peterson murder, one of the unsolved cases from my initial investigation that had led to my downfall. The same ligature marks, the same peculiar knot. A flicker on my monitor caught my eye, an incoming email. The sender's address was a string of random characters, a ghost in the machine. The subject line read, a reminder. My stomach tightened. I opened it. The body of the email was a single image. It was a photograph taken from a distance of me standing outside the crime scene tent earlier that evening. I was looking down, my shoulders hunched against the rain. It was unsettlingly clear despite the poor lighting. My hand stilled. This was someone who knew I was back, someone who was watching me. "User MB, you need to see this," a colleague said, his voice urgent. She held up a printed document. It was a partial printout of my preliminary report on the current case, the one I had been working on just minutes ago. But it was different. Significant sections were altered, subtly but crucially. My observations about the Thorn connection were gone, replaced with rambling, nonsensical theories. My initial assessment of the victim's profession was twisted into something paranoid and delusional. This wasn't just sabotage. It was an attempt to discredit me, to make me look unstable, to paint me as the very thing they'd accused me of being all those years ago. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my voice tight. "It was just slipped under the door of the main office," she replied, looking bewildered. "It's addressed to the lead detective, but it has your name all over it." My eyes scanned the doctored report, the familiar words warped into a grotesque parody of my own thoughts. Thorn, or someone else, someone using Thorn's legacy as a shield. I looked back at the email, the photograph of me in the rain. They were taunting me, playing with me. This wasn't just about solving murders anymore. It was about survival. The air inside the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, hung thick and damp, smelling of wet canvas, ozone, and something metallic that I knew too well. Outside, the storm hammered against the taut fabric, a relentless percussion section to the grim tableau unfolding before me. A single harsh light cast long, distorted shadows, making the already unsettling scene feel like a fever dream. I knelt beside the body, my gloved fingers hovering over the intricate knot tied around the victim's wrists. It was the same kind of knot, the same deliberate, almost artistic presentation. My breath hitched. This was not just a copycat, this was a signature, a message, and it was directed at me. A colleague, their face a mask of professional detachment, stood a respectful distance away, observing my movements. They'd found the body an hour ago, tucked away in this forgotten alcove of the old shipping yard, a place most people steered clear of. The victim was a mid-level executive from a tech firm downtown. No obvious connection to the previous victims, at least not on the surface. That was the trick, wasn't it? The killer was weaving a tapestry of disparate lives, each thread pulled taut by a single sinister design. "Anything, user MB?" The colleague's voice was low, barely audible over the drumming rain. I didn't look up, my focus locked on the subtle details. Skin around the ligature marks was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, not from pressure alone. There was something else at play here, a chemical agent. I'd seen it before in the cold cases, the ones that had driven me into exile. "It's the same," I murmured, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "The knot, the staging, and look at this." I gestured with my chin towards the victim's neck. A faint, almost imperceptible bruising, not consistent with strangulation, more like a deliberate pressure point applied with extreme precision. The colleague moved closer, peering intently. "I don't see anything, user MB. The M.E. will be here soon, they'll confirm everything." "They'll confirm what they're trained to see," I replied, a familiar frustration bubbling up. "This isn't about brute force, it's about knowledge, about understanding the body's vulnerabilities." I ran a gloved fingertip over the faint discoloration, and understanding my vulnerabilities. My mind flashed back to the archived files, the grainy photographs of victims from years ago. The same meticulous knots, the same eerily calm poses, the same subtle indicators that had been dismissed as anomalies by the original investigators. Anomalies that had eaten away at me, driving me to obsess, to the point where my career imploded. And now, here it was again. Not just a ghost of the past, but a tangible, terrifying reality. I stood up, my knees protesting slightly. The colleague handed me a small evidence bag containing a single tarnished silver cufflink. It was ornate with an unfamiliar crest etched into its surface. The victim hadn't been wearing it. It had been placed on the tarp near their head as if dropped carelessly. "This wasn't on him," the colleague stated. "No," I agreed, taking the bag. The crest was a stylized raven, wings outstretched, clutching a single perfect pearl. I'd seen it before, not on a victim, but where? My mind scrambled, sifting through a lifetime of case files, of faces, of forgotten details. Then it hit me. A witness statement, a fleeting glimpse, a description of a man seen loitering near the scene. He'd been wearing cufflinks. She described them as distinctive, with a bird and a pearl. At the time, it had seemed insignificant, a detail so minor it was almost certainly a misremembering. But now, my gaze swept over the tent, the stark reality of the situation pressing in. This wasn't just a killer playing games. This was a carefully orchestrated performance, and I was being cast in a starring role. The cufflink was a deliberate breadcrumb, a taunt. It meant the killer knew I'd be looking at the old cases. They knew my history. "The crest," I said, holding up the bag. "Does it mean anything to you?" The colleague shook their head. "Never seen it. Looks old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. Yes, and expensive. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was personal. The killer was leaving me clues, not to help me solve it, but to lead me down a path of their choosing. My thoughts raced, piecing together fragments. The witness statement, the distinctive knot, the chemical traces, the staged poses. They all pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. The killer wasn't just a copycat. They were someone with intimate knowledge of my past investigations, someone who had access to the details that had been buried, classified, or simply overlooked, someone who was now actively, deliberately reaching out to me. I looked back at the victim, there still form a stark reminder of the stakes. The rain continued its assault, the world outside the tent a blur of gray and black. I wasn't just investigating a murder. I was walking into a trap. And the architect of that trap was someone who knew me better than I knew myself. The question wasn't who was killing people anymore. It was who was orchestrating this entire elaborate charade, and why were they so intent on dragging me back into the light? The raven crest seemed to mock me from within the plastic bag. This was no longer just about justice for the victims. It was about my own survival. The flap of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, was pulled back by a uniformed officer, letting in a gust of damp, cold air that made my teeth chatter. Rain hammered on the canvas above, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to mock the stillness within. This wasn't just another staged tableau, this one felt different, more deliberate. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of the lilies scattered around the victim. Lilies, just like the first one. I ducked under the flap, my eyes immediately drawn to the body. A man slumped against an overturned wooden crate, his eyes wide and staring, fixed on some unseen horror. His skin had that waxy pallor I knew too well, a testament to the hours that had passed since his life had been extinguished. But it was the details that snagged my attention, the meticulously placed items that screamed the killer's signature. A single, tarnished silver locket rested on his chest, open to reveal two faded portraits, a woman and a child. "Anything, user MB?" the lead detective asked, his voice a low rumble against the storm's din. He stood a respectful distance away, hands tucked into the pockets of his rain-slicked coat, his gaze fixed on me. He knew better than to crowd me. I ignored him for a moment, my gaze sweeping over the scene, the lilies, the locket, and then my eyes landed on the small, leather-bound notebook clutched in the victim's rigor mortised hand. It was open, a single page filled with elegant, looping script. My breath hitched. "It's him," I murmured more to myself than to the detective. "It's the same killer." The detective stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "You're sure this is the fifth one, but the MO has been inconsistent. Inconsistent only if you're looking for a pattern of violence, not if you're looking for a pattern of messages." I pointed to the notebook. "Look." He leaned in, squinting at the writing. "A poem? Not just any poem," I said, my voice tight. "It's a fragment from the Raven, Poe, the same author whose work was referenced in the second case, remember? The victim was found with a copy of The Fall of the House of Usher open to a specific page. And the lilies, they're associated with mourning but also with purity, a twisted kind of tribute." I knelt beside the body, my gloved fingers hovering over the locket. It felt cold, ancient. I could almost feel the weight of its history. This locket, it's a direct echo of the unsolved case from 12 years ago, the one that ended my career. The detective was silent for a beat. The woman and child case. I nodded, my gaze never leaving the locket. The portraits were too faded to discern features, but the sentiment was unmistakable. A stolen family, a life cut short. "He's not just recreating the crimes, is he?" the detective said, his voice losing its professional detachment. "He's taunting you?" A cold dread began to coil in my stomach. Taunting me. Yes, he was leading me on a breadcrumb trail, each step designed to bring me closer to the edge of my own past. This wasn't about justice for these victims, it was about breaking me. I carefully opened the notebook further. The killer had been here recently, too recently. The writing on the page was a direct response to the first stanza of The Raven. "Once upon a midnight dreary," while I pondered, weak and weary. I read aloud, the victim's hand was positioned as if he'd been writing it. "And the next line," the detective prompted. "Over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore." I finished, my mind racing. The killer wanted me to complete the verse. He wanted me to engage. My eyes scanned the rest of the crime scene. The crate the victim was leaning against, the way the lilies were arranged. It was all too perfect, too staged. A stage set for my personal drama. I noticed it then, a faint scuff mark on the wet ground, just beyond the pool of lamplight cast by our portable units. It was subtle, easily missed, but it led away from the body, towards the edge of the tent where the fabric met the muddy earth. I stood, my movements stiff. "He wants me to follow." The detective's eyes narrowed. "User MB, we have protocol. We secure the scene. He's not going to wait for protocol." I cut him off, my gaze fixed on that scuff mark. The rain was starting to ease, the drumming on the tent roof subsiding to a steady patter. "This is it. He's drawn me in. He wants a confrontation." I moved towards the tent flap, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was a grim determination, a recognition that the game had reached its final, deadly stage. I had to see this through, for the victims, yes, but also for myself. For the chance to finally put the ghosts of my past to rest, or to be consumed by them entirely. As I reached for the flap, my hand brushed against something small and metallic tucked into the seam of the canvas. A tiny, almost invisible pin. I pulled it free. It was a miniature silver raven, its wings outstretched. A gift from the killer. A clear invitation. My gaze met the detective's. The path he had laid out for me all the way back to the beginning, and I was walking it. The taut canvas of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, flapped violently, a frantic drumbeat against the downpour. Each gust ripped at the fabric, threatening to expose the grim tableau within to the prying eyes of the storm. My breath hitched, a tight knot in my chest. This was it. The culmination of weeks spent chasing shadows, piecing together fragments of a shattered past. The air inside was thick, a cloying mix of ozone from the storm and something else, something metallic and final. The uniformed officers, faces grim and etched with fatigue, worked with a quiet efficiency, their movements precise, almost reverent. I ducked under the low entrance, the world outside, with its drumming rain and howling wind, fading into a muffled roar. And there he was, or rather, what was left of him. The body lay sprawled on the damp, stained tarp, arranged with that sickeningly familiar precision. The same subtle positioning of the limbs, the same meticulous placement of the hands. It was a grotesque echo, a carbon copy of the Holloway case, one of the cold cases that had haunted my career, the one that had sent me spiraling into exile. My gaze swept over the scene, cataloging every detail. The killer hadn't just replicated the past, they'd amplified it. The staging was more elaborate, more theatrical, a deliberate message. He stood a few feet away, his expression a mixture of weariness and reluctant respect. I didn't answer immediately. The rose, it wasn't part of the original crime. That was new, that was personal. The positioning, I finally said, my voice a low rasp. It's almost identical, but the rose, that's a deviation. The detective grunted, pulling out a small notebook. We found it tucked under his hand, almost missed it. I knelt beside the body, my gloved fingers hovering inches above the victim's face. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared up at the canvas ceiling, as if searching for answers that would never come. I felt a familiar ache, a pang of sorrow for the life extinguished, for the family left behind to grieve, anger. He's playing with us, I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. He wants me to know it's me he's targeting. Targeting and it was never solved. This killer. They're recreating my failures. I stood up, pacing the confined space of the tent. The rain hammered down, a relentless assault. I could feel the weight of every unsolved case, every wrong turn pressing in on me. This wasn't just about justice for these new victims. It was about redemption. My eyes landed on a small, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the tent floor near the victim's feet. It was out of place, too clean, too precise. It looked like it had been made by a specific type of shoe. Now, it screamed, did I secure the footprints outside the tent? I inquired, my voice suddenly urgent. The detective nodded. Uniforms have the perimeter locked down. Why? The killer was here recently and they were careful. They wore shoe covers, but there's a smudge, a specific kind of tread. I pointed to the mark. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's important. I moved back towards the entrance, my mind racing. The killer was taunting me, yes, but they were also leaving a trail that led not just to them, but to someone else. Someone who knew my work intimately. The tread mark, the meticulous staging. It all pointed to someone who was not only a meticulous planner, but also deeply knowledgeable about my past. A ghost from my past, perhaps. It's not just about recreating the past. It's about proving something, proving that I missed something or that I was complicit. The detective remained silent, his gaze fixed on me. He'd always been skeptical of my methods, my unconventional approach. But now I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, a sudden realization. Complicit, he echoed, his voice low. Someone fed me information back then, I explained, the words tumbling out. Someone who wanted me to fail, and they're doing it again, this killer. They're not working alone, they're a pawn, and the person pulling the strings. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest in my soul. I had walked away from my career, from my life, consumed by guilt and shame. But now, standing in this rain-soaked tent with the ghost of a past victim beside me, I felt a fierce determination ignite. I would not let this killer or the puppeteer behind them win. I would expose them no matter the cost. The game was far from over, but the final act was about to begin. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a bruised sky and the lingering scent of damp earth. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with a different kind of aftermath, the quiet hum of bureaucracy and the stale smell of coffee. It had been weeks since that night in the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered. Weeks of sterile interrogation rooms, of hushed conversations with lawyers, of a relentless, gnawing anticipation. My name, once mud, was being scrubbed clean. The evidence, painstakingly pieced together, had spoken louder than any accusation. The meticulous staging of the murders, the deliberate echoes of the cold cases that had haunted me, it all pointed to one truth. I hadn't been the one to fail. I had been the target. A colleague slid a file across the polished table. They're dropping everything, user MB. The charge is against I am officially dismissed, and the task force. They're recommending I for reinstatement. I picked up the file, the crisp paper cool against my fingertips. Reinstatement. It felt like a word from another life. I flipped through the pages, the legal jargon blurring before my eyes. It was all so clinical, so detached from the raw, visceral horror I'd experienced. The faces of the victims, the chilling precision of the killer, the suffocating weight of my own perceived failures, none of that was in this tidy report. My internal thoughts churned. This was it. The vindication I'd craved. The absolution I'd thought I'd never see. The cost. I'd lost years. I'd alienated everyone. My reputation had been shattered, my trust in myself eroded, and for what? To be proven right after the fact. I did good, user MB, the colleague said, his voice softer now. Real good, nobody else could have seen it, nobody else would have believed it. I managed a small nod, my gaze fixed on the photograph of the perpetrator, a man whose face was now etched into my memory with a grim permanence. He was in custody, the chase finally over. The world saw him as a monster, a serial killer. I saw him as a puppet master, a ghost from my past who had orchestrated my downfall. The investigation into the conspiracy is ongoing. The colleague continued, his tone shifting back to professional. They're still trying to trace the full extent of it. Who else was involved in feeding information, in manipulating the original cases? The conspiracy, that was the part that still unsettled me. The killer had been a pawn, albeit a highly effective and terrifying one. But who had been pulling his strings? Who had benefited from my disgrace, from the silencing of the truth? The answers were still buried deep beneath layers of deception. I stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too still. I needed to breathe. I needed to see the sky again, not through a smudged window, but under its vast, indifferent expanse. I need some air, I answered, my voice rough. Stepping outside, the city air, though still carrying the dampness of the recent rain, felt cleaner. The world hadn't stopped. People hurried by, oblivious to the silent battles fought and won within these walls. My battles. I walked, my footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. The case was closed. Officially, my name was cleared. They were a part of me now, scars that would never truly fade. The resolution I had been working towards felt less like an ending and more like a pause. The immediate threat was gone, but the deeper questions remained. The tapestry of deceit was vast, and I had only glimpsed a fraction of its intricate, disturbing pattern. I stopped, looking up at the sky. The clouds were breaking, allowing slivers of sunlight to pierce through. It wasn't a triumphant dawn, but it was a dawn nonetheless. A chance to rebuild, to find my footing again. The conspiracy, the unseen hands that had tried to break me, were still out there, and I would find them. This time I wouldn't walk away. The flap of the crime scene tent in the rain, body just discovered, billowed inward, letting in a gust of damp, cold air that smelled of wet earth and something metallic. I pulled my collar tighter, the worn wool scratching my neck. It was a familiar scent, one I'd tried to scrub from my life for years, but it always found its way back. The uniformed officer at the entrance nodded, his face a pale blur in the dim light. He didn't need to say anything. I could see it in the way he held himself, the slight slump of his shoulders. Another one. Stepping inside, the air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken finality of death. The tent, usually a sterile, controlled environment, felt chaotic, a temporary bubble against the relentless downpour. The canvas overhead dripped rhythmically, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the silence. My gaze fell on the body. It was different, not in the staging, not in the meticulous, almost artistic placement of the victim's limbs, but in the absence of it. The previous victims had been carefully arranged, their deaths a macabre performance. This one, however, was a mess. A brutal, desperate struggle had clearly taken place. There were signs of tearing, of frantic attempts to escape. It was raw, ugly, and utterly devoid of the killer's signature flair. A colleague, his face etched with exhaustion, was kneeling by the body, his gloved hands hovering over the victim's chest. He looked up as I approached, a flicker of something relief, resignation in his eyes. "User MB," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Glad you could make it, this one. It's not like the others." I knelt beside him, my own gloved fingers tracing the faint outlines of bruising on the victim's arms. The pattern wasn't random. It spoke of restraint, of a forceful grip. But the overall scene was chaotic, unlike the precise choreography of the previous murders. "The staging," I murmured, my eyes scanning the immediate surroundings. "It's missing." "Exactly," the colleague confirmed. "We found them like this. No props, no specific arrangement, just this." He gestured to the body. My mind raced, sifting through the details of the past weeks, the grim tableau of staged deaths. Each one a twisted echo of a cold case, a ghost from my past brought to life. And then the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a return to the killer's old style. This was a deviation, a significant one. "They were trying to throw us off," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Or they were interrupted. The colleague frowned. Interrupted. By whom? I stood up, my gaze sweeping across the tent, then out towards the unseen perimeter. The rain still hammered down, blurring the edges of the world. Think about it, the killer's meticulous, every detail planned, and then this, A messy, desperate struggle. It's not their MO. My thoughts were a tangled knot of possibilities. The conspiracy, had they been closing in? So the killer isn't necessarily the mastermind? The colleague asked, a dawning understanding in his voice. No, I confirmed, my voice tight. The killer was a puppet, but someone else was pulling the strings, and they're clearly getting nervous. I walked over to a small table set up near the tent's entrance where a few evidence bags lay neatly arranged. One contained a single, tarnished silver locket. I'd seen it before on a previous victim. It had seemed like a meaningless trinket, a random detail in the killer's elaborate game. But now, I picked it up, turning it over in my gloved hand. It was old, worn, smoothed by time. Inside, a faded photograph, a woman, her smile soft and gentle, a face I almost recognized. This locket, I said, holding it up. It's been at every scene. I dismissed it as part of the killer's aesthetic, but what if it's not? The colleague leaned closer, peering at the photograph. Who is she? I don't know, I admitted, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. They were sending a message, a personal one. My mind flashed back to the files, the dusty records of unsolved crimes, the victims, their lives, and the connections, subtle but undeniable, that had been buried for so long. The conspiracy wasn't just about silencing me. It was about burying the truth of these murders, of a pattern that had been allowed to fester for decades. Or hiding something, and the killer. They were just the instrument of that protection. I looked back at the body on the ground, at the desperate struggle etched into its final moments. This wasn't the end of the killer's game. It was the beginning of the end of their game, the game of manipulation, of deceit, of buried truths. The rain outside seemed to intensify, the drumming on the canvas a deafening roar. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The years of exile, the self-recrimination, the gnawing guilt, it all began to recede. I had been a pawn, too, in their grand design, but no longer. I looked at the colleague, my gaze steady. We need to go back to the beginning. And this time, I said, my voice firm, we're going to find out who these women were. The chase was on. I would be hunting them. The rain outside continued its relentless assault, washing away the old, making way for the new. And in that cleansing downpour, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose.